Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Summer Playoffs Round Number 2 overview and analysis video. We are really getting into the thick of things when it comes to the playoffs and the teams that are going to be competing for not only, good standings here in the Summer Playoffs, but of course regional qualifier spots. This is really where a lot of that is going to be determined. Top 6 is usually good enough in order to confirm your spot, and so winning here is pretty darn important. Obviously, it opens up the opportunity for you to move on even further. It's not like any team in the LPL right now is completely unbeatable. It's a pretty wide open league, and so quite a lot can happen. These series that have been happening the past couple of days have been really fun to watch, and I'm excited to go over them on this channel. If you're excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Did you expect the outcomes of these series, or were you surprised? I'll definitely be going over my thoughts and opinions in this video, but if you want to know my thoughts on round number 1 or anything else that's been going on in the LPL over the past couple of months, you can check out the playlist and the video up in the iCard right now. Up there is, of course, the round number 1 analysis. The play-ins are going to be in the playlist, and every single week of the LPL for the entirety of the summer split is going to be in that playlist as well. So if you're interested in my thoughts on how we ended up getting here, that is definitely a great place to start. But today, we are going to be going over the round 2 matchup, so let's get into it, shall we? If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the round 2 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be previewing round number 3. Of course, it's a gauntlet-style playoff format with the upper and the lower side of the bracket, and so whoever wins today, they're not done just yet. We've got one more series, one more round after this before we even get into the double elimination part of the bracket, the top 4, if you will, here in the LPL, and so still a lot on the line. These teams cannot afford to take their foot off the gas, even if they win here today. So let's get right into the analysis, shall we? It's going to start off, of course, with our first round 2 series, the upper side of the bracket, as we typically go here, and this is probably the one that was a little bit more lopsided, at least in terms of the on-the-paper matchup, but we'll see if that actually ends up playing out the way we anticipate. It's the number 5 seeded JD Gaming taking on the number 9 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. NIP did a really good job to really recuperate from a horrible regular season. Obviously, they were fine in the qualification stage. In Group D, they looked pretty good. They got out of that group as the number 2 team, and honestly, they were pretty consistent there, but everything fell apart in the main stage of the regular season in Group Ascend, where they weren't able to win a single series, and that includes against teams like LGD. It just was looking like a complete dire circumstance. They end up making a roster change the week before playoffs. Aki is out, Leon is in. It's a complete change of pace in terms of playstyle. They're basically opposite players. Aki, much more of that Sejuani, Maokai facilitator type of jungler. Think Tarzan, think Karsa for LPL fans. He's going to be the kind of player that wants to play aggressive early, but in a way that gets his laners ahead and isn't willing to skirmish or really risk the game all that much. He's much more of a 5v5 team fighter, that kind of idea. Whereas Leon coming in, obviously much more aggressive, kind of known as one of the more aggressive junglers in the LPL. He has been a spark plug for quite a few teams in the middle of splits over the past few years, and that's kind of what he is hoping to be for NIP. It kind of was the case in their previous series against LGD. He was very good in that series. He wasn't the one dragging them across the finish line. Rookie and Juo were definitely the 2 best players in that previous series, but Leon's change of playstyle for this team, I think, has generally benefited these other 2 players to allow them to play a lot more free in the early game. Rookie loves skirmishing early. He loves being able to move around the map and trying to play aggressive. Juo, I think, has benefited the most from someone like Leon coming in, allowing him to roam a lot more and not be focused as much on the isolated 2v2, where, quite frankly, Photic and Juo just aren't very good. And Shanji, I thought, had a pretty good series against LGD as well. He just needs to be stable on the top side. For the most part, he just doesn't want to be weak side. That's really where he has struggled over the course of this year. But still, this is a team that went 0-9 or 0-8 or whatever they went in Group Ascend, and they're taking on JD Gaming, who absolutely are going to be the favorites going into this. Now, this is not the same JD Gaming team that you might remember even from spring, but let alone from last year. Obviously, the roster changes have been both positive and negative in certain ways. Kanavi and Ruler are still looking amazing, world-class players, in my opinion. Kanavi was near the top of the MVP race for a majority of the regular season. Here in summer, his performance has definitely dipped down the stretch, which is at least a bit concerning, but it's Kanavi. I don't think he's going to underperform in the playoffs. It's just not something that he has historically done. Ruler, another player who typically gets better when the games get more important. He was much better in summer than he was in spring. There were real concerns about this bot lane 2v2 in terms of what they were putting out at the beginning of the year when you think back to January and February and March and, that time. But Ruler, I think, has really collected himself and gotten back to the form that we expected him to be on. The concern is everyone else on this team. Obviously, Missing has really just been a guy here in the support position. I've been pretty unimpressed with his performances over the course of this split. And, I think with support getting harder and harder, I think it's becoming clearer that these players that were a little bit more one-dimensional in terms of the styles that they ended up playing are actually being punished. And Missing, in particular, being much more lane-focused than he is, team fight-focused, is actually really hurting him as a support in this meta. Yagao coming in to replace Knight, that has certainly not been an upgrade. We talked about it in the offseason. It was pretty absurd for them to make that decision. I believe it was at the behest of Kanavi, but who really knows at the end of the day. Yagao has quite frankly had one of his weaker splits ever so far here for JDG, and that's a really bad place to be sitting, but it's Yagao. As long as he can be stable enough to survive in the mid lane matchup, then, his biggest trait is that he allows players like Kanavi and Ruler to pop off and win games because he doesn't need a lot of resources. We are sitting in a mid lane focused meta though, so we'll see how that ends up going. And then top lane, Sheer has been playing basically the entirety of the summer split. That seems like it's the right decision. However, I am going to kind of spoil this a bit. Sheer doesn't play at all in this series, and that is such a bafflingly crazy decision in my brain for you to have invested the entirety of the regular season into playing Sheer and then to put Flandre back in here for a playoff series. It's kind of what they did last split. It only kind of worked. People are going to look at that really good series that Flandre had, that, their first series in the playoffs last split, and be like, oh yeah, Flandre should be playing in the playoffs, but people forget that he was horrible the rest of the playoff run. And so I really hate this decision, regardless of whether it works or not. I think on paper, from a principle and a process perspective, this is a disaster of a choice from JD Gaming, and I think it could really come back to hurt them, but we'll see if Flandre can actually punish Shanji. At least for now, I still think JDG on paper looks like the better team, even if they are making bad decisions coming into this, but they've not been particularly consistent, especially in recent times. NIP gaining some confidence, beating Rare Atom, beating LGD. That's going to be a really intriguing factor, because I think they probably have more momentum than a team like JDG coming into this series, but JDG certainly more talented. Kanavi and Ruler absolutely should be the two best players in this series, and that should be enough to get them over the line. I definitely predicted JD Gaming, and if they lose this, it would be a pretty massive upset, but NIP is certainly not a team that you can overlook with how they've been playing in the recent weeks. So, going game by game means we get to start with game number one, talking about everything in this series, so let's get to it. The winner of game number one was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is pretty massive for NIP, just to establish themselves early on, because this was kind of a dominating game. They were better basically from moment one. And that's huge. This was a bit of a slower early game, which typically speaking, I would say actually favors JD Gaming. You've got, Ruler and Kanavi and even Flandre to an extent that are all very experienced in these front-to-back 5v5s. And NIP definitely feels a lot more focused on skirmishes and on picks and on, these less concrete, more chaotic scenarios. But it was kind of NIP that was a lot more clinical in terms of their execution in the mid to late game. And that's what allowed them to get this gigantic lead. It was honestly incredibly impressive. Player of the game could go to two players, in my opinion. There were two options here. To me, it's pretty obviously Rookie. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to Zhuo, and trust me, Zhuo was awesome on the rel, but the two players that really stood out in the LGD series continue to really stand out here. Zhuo in particular, we're actually going to talk about him first. We'll get to Rookie in just a second. Zhuo has historically been a phenomenal playoff performer, which feels like it should be wrong, because a lot of people look at him as this big bust, and I agree, his regular season performances have actually been pretty bad. The problem has been him getting to playoffs in the first place, but once he's gotten there, he's actually been really good for most of the teams that he's played for, and that's really carried over here for NIP. He's been awesome through the beginning part of this playoff run. Another great rel game, a couple of phenomenal engages. He was just looking so aggro and so proactive in terms of where he was looking for a lot of these engages throughout the game. And I think not feeling tethered to Photic, not feeling like he has to play for the 2v2 has just completely opened up what he can do individually as a player. And so that's been fun to watch. It's funny because Photic, I think, is my classic LPL example of a player who gets worse in the playoffs. He's been fine so far. I think he's definitely been a bit overstated in terms of how successful he's been for this team, but the Ezreal helps out a lot, allows him to do basically everything. I think it's the strongest AD in the game at the moment. And then Rookie in the mid lane, he is going to get player of the game. I mean, this is just a dominant performance from Rookie. We talked about Kanavi and Ruler potentially being the best players in this series. Rookie is very much going to make a case to be in that conversation. He was really struggling down the stretch. Obviously, everybody was. This team doesn't, you know, they probably win a series if anyone on this team is performing like a human being, but Rookie, I think, has most recovered and recuperated from whatever was happening down the stretch of the summer split. So that's really awesome to see his ability to play these team fights. He was dodging skill shots left and right. He was maximizing his damage at every possible time. Like, this was an ace level game from Rookie. This is what an MVP caliber player looks like when they are on form. Leon and Shanji were good as well. Shanji targeted a bit early by JDG. They wanted to try to shut the Nasus down. Shanji's been notoriously bad on weak side, but it's Nasus. He was essentially inevitable, especially when the rest of this team started winning. Once they started getting gold and pressure, you know, Nasus could start getting online, and then it was a snowball effect from there. Leon was also pretty good on the Zyra. My only concern is that this is essentially the only champion that he has had any success on so far. With NIP, I'm interested to see if teams just like ban out the Zyra, because all three of their wins against LGD were Leon on Zyra, and he was playing it for the most part against RA as well. Game number 1 here, he wins on it again. So it's certainly something I would be looking at taking away if I were other teams. It just seems to be a huge comfort pick for Leon at the current moment, but obviously his change in mentality has really helped the team overall. NIP looked great here in game 1. Rookie and Juo have been the absolute stars of this team, but nobody was really the weak link, and I think that's the biggest change, in my opinion, coming from the regular season. And then for JDG on the other side, this is bad. Like, this is not good. You were already a team that was coming in here with less momentum, less confidence, and you kind of got blown out in game number 1. It wasn't really all that close. You were a bit even through the first 15-ish minutes of the game, but it was mostly because the game was rather slow. The moment that things started to pick up, you just completely fell apart. I think Kanavi and Ruler played well. Big shocker. They're the two players that have generally done the most for JD Gaming. I think their scorelines might not individually indicate that they were the best players, but I certainly think they were. Flandre got a ridiculous amount of assistance early on. They just were 2v1ing Shanji, as, you know, kind of in the top lane here with the Jace, and it kind of worked out. Like, they were able to get Flandre a gold lead, but again, Nasus is pretty inevitable so long as the game goes long enough, and as long as Nasus is in a good position to get those stacks, and so it ended up not really mattering in the end. The problems, it's the same players. It's Yagao and it's Missing, both who I thought had really horrible games here. Missing is going to get dud of the game. This was awful from Missing, caught out constantly in bad positions, bad engages. I mean, this just felt horrible. Again, his biggest issue is that he is kind of a 2v2 minded player. He loves playing early games. He loves playing mid games. He's not really a great team fighter, or he's a good team fighter, but he's not like an elite level team fighter. And that means in these metas where games are going a bit longer, all of a sudden you don't have that same kind of consistency his Missing was giving you the last 2 years. And that's been a bit of an issue for JD Gaming. He was really bad in the back half of this game, and so was Yagao. I know people like to just claim that Aurora is unbeatable and broken, and, you know, you can't really stop her. I have said on multiple occasions on this channel that I think she's strong, but not unbeatable. Her early game is incredibly weak, and if you're not in good positions in the late game, she can't really do any of the things that she wants to do. She really does rely on the enemy team screwing up in order for her to be as broken as she can be. That doesn't mean that she doesn't have a ton of tools. She absolutely does, but I don't think she's this auto-win condition that other people make her out to be, and Yagao proved that here. He got completely gapped by Rookie in lane, out of lane, in team fights, just wasn't particularly close. Yagao has to be better, and Missing has to be better. JDG had some interesting game plans here in game number 1, but they just lost when it mattered the most. They lost the fights, they lost the front-to-backs, and if you are doing that, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't really matter how good your game plan is, and so we'll have to see if that ends up translating over. It's just game number 1. It's not time to panic just yet, but you got to get back on the board here in game number 2. If NIP is able to take that 2-0 series lead, boy, is that going to completely change the perception and the complexity of this series moving forward. So we'll have to see if JDG can even it up or if NIP can take that commanding lead. We're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and man, did they need to do this. They needed to come out here and show that they could still compete, that they could at least go toe-to-toe with NIP, and they did that. They wrangled back control of this series, and now you're just heading into a best of 3. You've already beaten NIP in a best of 3 over the course of this split. This is a much more comfortable spot for JDG to be in. For NIP, obviously, this is not ideal. Kind of similar to game 1, except the blowout kind of started a lot earlier here here for them. JDG is just so much more clinical in terms of what you would expect from them. This is kind of the expectation for how I thought a lot of these games were going to go, with NIP doing some interesting things early, but just not being able to keep it up. Ironically enough, I think some of their players, one of their players, actually played maybe their best game of the playoffs up until this point. Shout out Fodik, who I thought was pretty good in this game, but nobody else really was able to do anything, and it allowed JDG to really take over. Player of the game is pretty obviously, to me, going to go to Kanavi in the jungle. The only other player that I think could remotely get this is Flandre in the top lane here on the Aurora. And that's only really because he got to just do the Aurora things with the rest of the team starting to take over, but it was Kanavi that established all of the pressure, and he was the one that was taking over all of the team fights. And so for me, it was pretty obvious that he was player of the game. Again, Kanavi is the most important piece for JDG by a lot. When he plays really well, when he's on a champion like Viego instead of a champion like Sejuani, he can carry games 1v9 if he has to. He didn't have to this game. Everybody else played, well, fine enough at the very least, and, Kanavi was just kind of allowed to be the star, but that's really the formula and the strategy that you want if you're JDG in order to move forward in a series like this. So great game number 2 from Kanavi, exactly what you wanted to see. Flandre missing, they played really well. You need those players to step up. Missing was infinitely better in game 2 than he was in game 1. Not getting caught out nearly as much. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that obviously JDG had all the map pressure in this, but at the very least, not having bad moments is all you really need to get out of him when you have Ruler and Kanavi on this team. And then Flandre with the Aurora in the top lane looked pretty solid. I still think that champion really doesn't do anything in the early game, and that can definitely be a problem. It's much less of a problem in the top lane, which is why I think we're seeing it be a lot more consistent. In that role, you just need to be more active in the middle of the map if you are going to be a champion like Aurora, and she doesn't really have the tools to do that unless she's in the late game, unless she's in these big skirmishes or finding picks for her team. And so throwing her up in the top lane, I think it's just going to be a bit more consistent, as we saw here with Flandre. Yagao was pretty good on the Corki, definitely better than Rookie, who made a ton of mistakes over the course of this game. Funnily enough, I think Fodik was better than Ruler in game number 2 here, but it just didn't really matter. Everybody else was good on JDG, and that's good enough for them to be able to get to a win. If Ruler starts playing well, this series should still be very much in favor of JDG after this win. And then for NIP, this kind of felt like them crashing back down to earth at least a little bit. It's them forcing the issue, playing super aggressive, and JDG just calling their bluff and outplaying them at basically every facet of the game. Done of the game is pretty easily going to go to Rookie. He was pretty awful in this one. There really is no redeeming qualities from this Zeri game. I think, generally speaking, Yagao just doing more damage, being more resilient in these team fights, and Rookie just overstepping, getting caught in side lanes, being bad in 5v5s. There really just wasn't a lot of good from Rookie. This is kind of a small dichotomy of Rookie where game 1 and game 2 are a great example of what he has been over the course of 2024, where you have game 1 where he's popping off and carrying the team and, looking like an MVP favorite, and then the next game he just completely runs it. It's kind of been a lot of that over the course of this year, where there's just been no consistency for Rookie from a game-to-game basis, and we kind of got that once again here. He's going to have to lock in if this team even wants a remote chance of being able to win this series. Leon also looked significantly more punishable when Rookie wasn't generating a ridiculous amount of pressure in the middle of the map. They're still allowing him to get Zyra early on in drafts. It's kind of ridiculous. I think you just have to ban out this champion. I understand it didn't quite work out here in game 2, but at least force him to show that he can play something else. I'm not going to get frustrated, but I am going to get a little bit concerned if teams are just ignoring it entirely, not even attempting to take it away on B1. On blue side, I do like the Ezreal pick. I think it's very safe, but you know what I mean. Shanji also significantly less useful here on the Udyr than he is on the Nasus. Very weird thing to say. I don't think either champion is inevitable, but Nasus is certainly closer, and Shanji on weak side's just not a great combination. Zhuo wasn't really able to do anything on the rel, but like I said, Fodik actually had a pretty good game here. Maybe his best individual game of the playoffs. It just didn't end up mattering because he was Jhin and, the rest of his team lost. And as much as I love Jhin, I think he's a great pick. You can't 1v9 on Jhin. That's not really the point of drafting the champion. So for NIP, you gotta get some of that confidence back. It's really gonna be about the mid games in this series. If one team can really pull away with these gigantic gold leads, like has happened in both of the first 2 games, then I really think that that's going to make it really easy to determine who's going to win a game. But, these close games are going to come down to execution, and so far, NIP's needs to be better. But is that going to happen in game 3? We're essentially entering a best of 3 now. Winning game number 3, in my opinion, the most important game to win when the series is tied 1 apiece. And so who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1. And man, they're looking pretty darn good. They're beating JDG kind of at their own game at the current moment. Yes, their early games have definitely been better. Ironically enough, a lot of that is actually coming through the bot lane right now, which I thought was going to be the least likely lane to end up winning early for NIP, but their execution in the mid to late game is what has gotten them to a 2-1 series lead, and that is the reason that they are now one game away from eliminating JDG from the playoffs and from locking themselves into a spot in the regional qualifiers, which would be pretty insane considering how a lot of this summer split is gone. But honestly, they kind of deserve it with the way that they are playing right now. This is a very fun team, and especially because they finished top 4 last split, there really is some upside for them to continue to get better if they keep moving along. For JD Gaming, it's just a disaster. This team has kind of collapsed in a lot of key ways. I think that there were a couple of players who played well again for them in this one. Not necessarily the players you would want to play well. I think that there were some underperformances as well, but generally speaking, JDG is just not living up to the hype at the current moment. We kind of expected this team to figure it out going into playoffs. That has very much not happened so far in this series. They're not dead yet, but they are on their last life. For NIP, player of the game could go to quite a few people. I think that there are really two and a half that you can give this to. I'm going to agree with the broadcast and give this to Shanji. Kashanji in the top lane continues to be an absolute menace. This is his best champion by far. He is just so utterly dominant on Kazante that it's honestly unfair to try and play into it. Flandre tried his best to pick Zac and survive on the top side and be useful in these late game team fights, but Shanji was just so much more useful, constantly holding off basically all of the damage from JDG, allowing Smolder and Zyra and Misfortune to kind of do their own things, and then when he needed to side lane, when he needed to pick up a solo kill, when he needed to 1v4 and get a kill in that, he could do that. So Shanji just looking amazing. I mean, this is the champion that you want to see him on in these pivotal moments. I know a lot of people think about the Rumble and even the Shyvana top for Shanji as things that have been like signature picks. At this point, Kazante has usurped them all in terms of the pressure that he applies. I think Zhuo is the other player that you simply have to consider for player of the game. He's just awesome, man. The support gap in this series has been ginormous. Zhuo has been so much better than Missing. Even in their win in game 2, I really don't think Zhuo played bad at all, and Missing has just been a problem. So, congrats to Zhuo. I think this is a player that I have, at least last year I stuck my neck out and said he's better than he's getting credit for. Photic is a lot worse than he's getting credit for, and I think Zhuo is being dragged down in terms of opinion by him on NIP. That has kind of carried over. I think obviously their good spring shows that they are both very capable at times. Photic has had some good performances, including in this game, but Zhuo is the real star of the bot lane at the moment. Rookie is kind of the half player that you could consider for player of the game, if only because he was kind of the damage that allowed them to win these late game team fights on the Smolder, but it's the setup that I was really impressed by here with Shanji and Zhuo. Leon continues to get caught out in some unfortunate situations, but as long as he's on Zyra, he knows what he's supposed to be doing. Like, it's literally like a 99% play rate for him at this point. I'm not going to complain about it the entire series because it would get boring to hear me say this every game, but spoiler alert, he's not going to get taken off of the Zyra at all in this series either, so don't really know what's going on. This guy's essentially not forced to do anything other than the most comfortable thing possible, and I think it's a gigantic mistake, but either way, still getting caught out a bit. The team was just really good around him, and then Photic continues to actually look pretty good, which I think is a good sign. Zhuo definitely the star, but Shanji, Zhuo definitely the two standing out. And then for JD Gaming on the other side, I just don't know what to say about Missing at this point. This guy is so bad when he is not able to actually just win early. His laning is really bad this series. He's been caught out multiple times. Zhuo has outplayed him. Photic has outplayed him in the 2v2. When your 2v2 is really struggling for JD Gaming, that's a problem because that's the lane that was supposed to be good in the 2v2 out of everything in this series when we were projecting it with how these two teams have played. And so for Missing to just consistently get caught out in the late game, for his laning to be bad, it's not good. Like, it's really, really bad for JD Gaming how poor Missing has been. Flandre was really bad in this one. This was his worst game of the series so far up until this point. The Zac was just entirely useless. It was really a pick to try to keep the Kazante from taking over, and it completely failed. The Kazante absolutely took over. Obviously, he didn't have a ton of pressure in the early game, but you wanted to draft him for the team fights, and even then, he was essentially completely irrelevant as we got into the 5v5 stage of this game. Kanavi, I think, also had probably his worst game of the series up until this point. The Nidalee just needs to be a lot more active in the early game when you're looking at ways for, JDG and NIP to really establish themselves. As I've said through the first couple of games, it's really whoever can get the drop on the other first. Whoever's able to get that big gold lead early on has been able to kind of translate that into easy teamfight success. When you're playing Nidalee, when you're playing, even something like a Jhin, like, you need to be able to capitalize on that draft pick early, and he just wasn't able to really do that. Yagao and Ruler, I think, were fine. Ruler actually played this game really well. People aren't going to look at that because Fodic also played well, but Ruler was really excellent for a majority of this game, and Yagao I thought was good in these late game team fights, but there's only so much that they can do. Again, if over half of the team is going to underperform, regardless of who the players are that are actually playing well, it's not going to matter for JDG, and that just continues to be their issue. For NIP, they look good here, but it's not over yet. You got to clean it up, and there are things that need to get better. I think Leon needs to get a bit more clinical in the back half of these games. Team fighting has never really been his strength, but it continues to be something that I think if the team was behind more, it would be exploited more. Overall, though, them being up 2-1 is ginormous. They could theoretically drop Game 4, but I'm sure they want to win this and end this series off in 4. For JDG, they got to keep their hopes alive, and they got to keep the rest of the year in their own hands by picking up a win at the very least here in Game 4. Are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 4 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. We have really yet to see like a major blowout in the playoffs proper, and that's been a blast for us League of Legends fans. We've just gotten more games, more close series, more back and forths, which is just good for the league overall. This was a very good game from JDG. This was probably the closest game of the entire series up until this point. NIP did have some interesting pieces. They were able to keep this game going a lot longer than I thought that they were going to be able to do. They were never really in a position to win it, but they did keep extending it, which I think is a good, at least sign from them. But JDG was definitely more clinical and better in the back half of this. And again, this is kind of what we were expecting. The NIP wins, they've been shocking in terms of how we've gotten there. It's not necessarily just them destroying the early game and scaling it out of control. It's them being better in these 5v5s, and that's really not what the scouting report on either of these teams were. So seeing a game like this where things are just a little bit more controlled and it goes longer and that favors JDG, it's just more of what I would have expected. An interesting draft. Kanavi pulling out the Skarner jungle is definitely intriguing. I did not see that coming as the answer to Zyra. It kind of worked in this game, if only because it was so active early, but I think a lot of the success of this game has to go to the carries, the damage carries, and for me that starts with Yagao, who's going to get my player of the game. We'll get to Flandre in just a minute here, but I want to talk about Yagao first because I do think he was the most relevant player for JD Gaming, disregarding the fact that he basically solo won the final fight of the game, which was definitely kind of the case. He was obliterating people with those quirky rockets. He was always in a good position, always playing with the rest of his team. I know Yagao gets a lot of hate, but one thing he has been good at, even in his worst moments, is being in the right spots, is knowing where he's supposed to be at any given moment. He's not out of position. He's not getting absolutely crushed in a side lane for no reason, not gaining any sort of pressure for his team. He's almost always where he is supposed to be, and that's always been his biggest asset, and that's why he has been so advantageous for carry junglers and carry bot lanes in the past, is because you can really rely on him to be there to facilitate that. But when he needs to carry, when he needs to do damage, he can have games like this. I really do think he was the most important player on JD Gaming, and I don't even think it was really all that close. So props to Yagao. I do want to shout out Flandre because the ultimates were really good this game from the Rumble. Rumble's one of those weird champs that I think people are starting to sour on, if only because it doesn't win lane nearly as hard as like it does conceivably, right? Like on paper, Rumble should be able to dominate basically any other lane matchup in the current meta, and I would agree that, you know, for the most part he does, but it's not necessarily played out in practice like that. His team fights are good, but he's not this like dominating champion that I think a lot of people thought he was at the beginning of the year, and so he's kind of landed in this nice spot where he's going to get banned out a lot, but when he's left up, he's not like ridiculously broken. And Flandre, if you're good at him, like Flandre is going to be able to take over in these team fights. Those ultimates are going to be well placed and they're going to do a ton of damage. And so I want to give him a lot of credit. I think Rumble's numbers are lower than people give him credit for, but his utility and his usefulness is still very high. Ruler also very good. He's so good at Jhin. Like this champion is so oppressive when you see a good AD carry play it, which we saw here. Missing Kanavi, they were fine as well, but Yagao to me was really the standout. And I don't know if he was getting talked about enough coming out of this game number 4. And then for NIP on the other side, again, just kind of letting it go a bit in the mid to late game. You had some interesting early game decisions here. I think JDG actually contested in the early game, which made things a bit more intriguing, but this game was actually pretty close for the early section. You were able to get gold on the Smolder in the mid lane. You were able to get at least some gold on the Zyra. I think both of those things are relative positives overall. The problem was you just weren't able to maintain that. The Smolder was really your only shot of being able to win any front-to-back 5v5s here, and that just didn't end up happening. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Zhuo. This is easily his worst game of the series. Up until this point, he has been the better support, arguably in all 3 games leading up into this, but the Rel just really couldn't get in. It feels like I'm defending him a bit too much, but I'm not going to blame it entirely on him. I think the champion has a hard time getting into Corki and Jhin and Rumble in a lot of these engages if you are in a negative position, and that's kind of the case. I definitely considered giving this to Shanji or Photic or even Leon at times, if only because I think they could have done more in some of these fights, but Shanji often positioned himself really well in a lot of these fights, and Photic just wasn't able to do anything because he's Ezreal, and he's behind in gold in the later half of the game. Rookie was the only player at least attempting to do things. He was also the player getting caught out the most, but for the most part, I would take the aggression if it meant giving this team any sort of chance of winning in the late game. So for NIP, you tried, but honestly, you felt a little outskilled, and if that's kind of the nature going into this game number 5, it's going to be really, really interesting. You've been able to, get the bounce back. Blue side has been really strong in this series so far. Is that going to continue here for NIP? Being able to win all the odd games, or is JDG going to be able to carry the game 4 momentum into a series win? This is incredibly important for both these teams in terms of what the rest of 2024 and potential Worlds qualification could look like. And so who's going to pick up the win? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to take this series 3-2, and the upset has been completed. They are moving on to round number 3. And maybe more importantly, they have officially qualified themselves for the regional qualifiers at the end of the year to potentially make the World Championships. Now, theoretically, I guess they could qualify through the playoffs themselves, but they'd probably have to get top 2 or top 1 to end up doing that. That's going to be a pretty crazy thing to ask of NIP. Technically, anything is possible for them. They are still alive, but this is a monumental win. This is probably the most important win they needed to get over the course of this entire tournament. And the fact that they were able to do it over a team in JD Gaming that was in the semifinals of Worlds the last 2 years, and yes, is certainly looking a bit more shaky, but, was expected to bounce back. The fact that they are able to walk out of this series with a win is genuinely incredible with how their summer split ended up going. You have to be excited for the team, for the org, for them to be able to put this together. It's really, really huge, and I am excited for them. For JDG, this is a disaster. They were massive favorites coming into this series for basically everyone, and even if you were taking into account the underperformances that they were giving in the regular season, they were still better than NIP, even at their absolute worst. For them to be able to come out of this without a win, that's disaster. Not winning a single series in the playoffs is a disaster. After not even getting a top 4 seed in the regular season, this doesn't feel like a Worlds team right now in JD Gaming, and that's absurd. Considering the talent on this roster, Kanavi and Ruler and even Yagao and Missing and Flandre, these are all players that have succeeded at the highest level, and yet we're sitting here and we're like, they probably won't be making Worlds. Now, they're not eliminated by any means just yet, depending on the result later on in this video. They could theoretically be eliminated from even qualifying for the regional qualifiers, but if the other result ends up happening, they very much still have a chance to play and qualify themselves there, but it's not looking good for them at the current moment. So we'll quickly talk about game number 5 because there is some interesting stuff to talk about here. Leon's going to get player of the game for me. This was his best game of the series by a pretty large margin. The Zyra of all 5 games in a row, it was all 4 games against LGD. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? Allowing this guy to continue to play this champion. I tweeted this out a couple of hours ago, but I'm not trying to sit here and say that Leon is a bad player or that he would not succeed on other champions, because I think there are other champions that fill similar roles to Zyra that he would probably play pretty well, but the fact that he's not even being asked to do any of that, the fact that he can just get away with 9 games of Zyra straight in the playoffs is pretty ridiculous, and we're sitting here with, 6 of those 9 games being victories? Nice, that's pretty absurd. It's genuinely, it's crazy that they keep allowing him to have this champ, but this was probably his best game in the playoffs, at least in my opinion. Probably the most consistent. His early game was awesome. He was everywhere on the map, was creating problems for JDG, and really keeping Kanavi from trying to take over the game on his signature Nidalee pick. We'll talk about Kanavi. The Nidalee did not look good in this series, and that was definitely a bit of the problem, but he was also very good in the late game. I think late game you're looking at Shanji potentially being the one that ends up really causing a huge impact for NIP. He's so good on these flanking patterns. I think in terms of flanking top laners and, trying to get themselves into the right position, he might be the best in the world at that. He's always been really good at finding himself in good positions in team fights, especially when he doesn't need to frontline, and that's exactly what he did here. Essentially a game-winning teleport flank here on the Renekton. So credit to Shanji, credit to Leon, but player of the series for me, maybe shockingly, it's gonna go to Zhuo. I honestly think he was the best player on NIP in the series, regardless of Game 4. I think Game 4 was definitely his weakest one, but a lot of that was kind of game-oriented. It wasn't necessarily his individual play. It was more so the situation of where he was at on the rail. I think in all 4 of the other games, he was really freaking good, and in all 3 of their wins, he was super important for this team. And so Zhuo's going to get my player of the series here over JDG. It just feels crazy to say that. Photic goes deathless, 5-0-1 on the Kaisa. He looked awesome in this series. This is the best of 5 he has ever played. I don't even think it's remotely close. Somebody who is kind of notorious for underperforming in the playoffs. He looked awesome here. Rookie was really good. Maybe not perfect. Again, very aggressive at times in this series, but at the end of the day, he stepped up when it mattered the most. NIP generally stepped up when it mattered the most, and they're walking away with a gigantic victory. And it doesn't end here. It's not like it gets a ton harder moving on to the next round. You would imagine it would, but you've got Weibo Gaming in the next round. They're not exactly an unbeatable team for NIP in the state that they're currently in. So we'll have to see how that ends up going, but for JD Gaming, this is a terrible loss. Like, you have to feel horrible if you're JDG. Now it's completely out of your hands. You're hoping and praying for an AL win on the bottom side of this bracket, because if FPX ends up taking this series that we'll talk about later on in the video, then JDG is just done. This is the last series that they will play in 2024, if that is the case. And for that to be out of their hands at all is ridiculous, and it just goes to show how much of an underperformance this is. Dud of the game is going to go to Yagao. Probably the worst game he played this series. Game 1 definitely was up there as well, but especially coming off of a really good Game 4 from him, it's very disappointing. And coming off of a summer split where he wasn't very good, that's very disappointing. People are going to continue to look at the Knight Yagao swap as one of the most lopsided in LPL history, and rightfully so, quite frankly. I got a lot of criticism for being so high on Knight in the offseason. I usually try not to sit here and be like, well, everything works out, but if you go watch my LPL grades video, I got a lot of criticism for a couple of the things I said in that video, and turns out a lot of it ended up being correct. So unfortunately, Yagao was a major downgrade here, and he really cost them in game number 5. I think Missing had a horrible series, completely gapped by Zhuo, was never really relevant. In their wins, he was okay, but in their losses, he was horrendous, just always in the wrong spaces, getting caught out super consistently. His laning this series was horrible. Photic and Zhuo took advantage of that, very consistently. Flandre, I don't think was good down the stretch. The fact that he was playing over Sheer at all is already kind of a disgrace, and it really came back to bite them in this series. Kanavi couldn't get anything going on his signature Nidalee. He got weaker as the series continued to progress. Ruler was generally fine. I don't think I had a real big problem with how he played, but he wasn't breaking the game. He wasn't taking over. He wasn't this top 3 player in the world that can win almost any circumstance like he has been in the past. He just wasn't the problem, which isn't good enough for this team. And now they are sitting here again. Everything's out of their hands. If their season is done, it's entirely their fault. And you got to feel like JDG is feeling the weight of that right now. They are hoping and praying for an AL win later on in the day. But for NIP, this is a pretty massive victory, and you just have to be excited for them. Again, it's not exactly getting a ton more difficult moving on to the next round, and so we'll see if they can keep this miracle run going. With the way that they played here, it's certainly not impossible for them to get top 4. But then now moving on to our second round 2 series, and this one, at least on paper to me, is significantly more interesting. I say that, but we just had an upset in the first series, and so what do I really know? It's the number 6 seeded Anyone's Legend taking on the number 7 seeded FunPlus Phoenix. Of course, FPX coming off of a win in round number 1 over Thunder Talk Gaming. That was kind of close. They were definitely the better team in that one, I would say, throughout a majority of the series, but some back and forth action for sure. They really needed a couple of players to step up, and they got a heroic performance from their mid laner, Care, who was phenomenal against Thunder Talk, the best series he has ever played in his career. It's not even remotely close, and if they get that version of him in the mid lane, that's going to be ginormous for FPX, because really, when you're describing FPX and the way that they play the game, most of the time, at least throughout 2024, it's been either Milky Way gets this gigantic lead early and they're able to snowball games out of control, or Milky Way doesn't get that gigantic lead early, Dectum and Life try their best to win the game and end up failing, at least against good teams. That's kind of been the story, it's kind of been the narrative, and if Care is going to emerge as somebody who can win games regardless of whether or not the team has an advantage or a disadvantage in the early game, that opens up so many more possibilities. It's felt so binary for FPX over the course of this year, really, that they either do have a lead and win or don't have a lead and lose. And I think if you have the opportunity to have someone other than Dectum who is able to win fights 5v5, that really makes things a lot easier. So FPX definitely became a lot more interesting after that series against Thunder Talk, but AL is definitely still going to be the favorite for me going into this series. I said it was very slight in my preview of this. The more I've thought about it, the more I can see that, FPX would really need a lot of things to go right. I think I was looking at Milky Way versus Krako and seeing a world in which Krako is inconsistent enough for that early game advantage that Milky Way has to be a bit of a problem for AL, but really nowhere else on the map do I feel good about FPX in this matchup. Shanks and Decare is really going to be the one to watch. I think if Shanks continues to be on the trajectory that he is on and that he has shown to be on over the last couple of splits, that's not a good thing for AL. Typically speaking, when you're talking about Shanks for the first 2/3 of the split, he's going to come out and look like an MVP. He's going to come out and look like the best mid laner in the entire region, somebody who deserves to be on a Worlds team and deserves to be in the upper echelon. And then the last third of every season, he is just horrible. It is very, very strange how things end up working out that way, but the inconsistencies of Shanks are a big reason why AL is down here at number 6 instead of higher up in terms of the seeding. That being said, Care is also pretty notoriously inconsistent. Going into the playoffs, he was a weak link for me when it came to FPX. If he shows up and shows out like he did against ThunderTalk, I think that FPX is actually in a pretty good spot to be able to make this series not only interesting, but potentially to make it their own. And then if that doesn't happen, if Shanks actually lives up to the potential and can actually be consistent for a best of 5, which, I know is a crazy thing to say, but if he can do that, then it shouldn't be particularly hard for AL to win these games. When Shanks is winning, this team is winning. It often just is the way that it goes. I also think Ale into ZDZ could be a massive advantage for AL. That was the matchup I really pointed out as the majorly in favor of AL matchup in my preview at the end of the round 1 video. I just think Ale is crazy good in all-pro caliber top laner, and ZDZ is not that. He has failed upwards onto FPX, and, Hope and KL decked him in life. I think they're relatively similar. Neither are really game-breaking, but both can have major outputs. Like KL and Life, I think, are both very aggressive roamers that can really make that work. Hope and Dectum are both much more comfortable at playing a weak side role in the early game and transitioning that into the late game, so relatively similar on that side of the map, but to me, it's all really about Shanks versus Milky Way. If one of them can just have a great series, if Shanks pops off for AL, it's going to be pretty easy for them to win. If Milky Way pops off for FPX, it's going to be pretty easy for them to win, so that's really going to be what to monitor, but the only way to know which team does end up coming out on top is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to pick up the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And again, this is exactly what you want to see from this team. You want to see them be able to control the pace of the game, get some small leads early, and just make that lead bigger and bigger and bigger as the game continues to go along. This was a masterclass from Shanks in the mid lane. We talked about how important it was going to be for him to perform well, and boy did he live up to the billing, at least here in game number 1. A very easy choice for player of the game. Was terrific on the Corki. The damage that he was able to do in the late game is obviously fantastic, but his ability to just outplay Care 1v1 so hard in the mid lane is genuinely astounding. This is not a matchup that should be particularly Corki favored early, as I'm sure you've all become accustomed to watching it over the course of this year, but Care got obliterated. He got solo killed in the mid lane here. Just not good enough. Care was awful in this game, and Shanks took advantage of that. The moment that he had that gigantic lead, he was everywhere else on the map, being able to pick up, random picks against Milky Way or picks on Life, just accumulating gold in the middle of this map and then using that to translate it into 5v5 pressure that, quite frankly, FPX just had no answer to. For a lot of this game, it felt almost entirely inevitable that Shanks was eventually just going to take it over, and that's exactly what he did. And so if the question was whether or not that consistent form was going to be able to come back from the beginning parts of the split, yeah, it was definitely there. The MVP level Shanks was in this series, or at least in this game, and that is a majorly good sign for AL. I think you also have to point out Kale, who was awesome here on the Rel. A lot of great engages, was definitely a bit of a support gap in this game. Life pretty constantly getting caught out on the Recon, just being a little bit too far forward, sometimes dying for the sins of his own teammates, but for the most part, he didn't have a great game, and Kale was everywhere, creating play after play after play. I love Kale. He is a huge channel darling. Going back to his time on Sandbox, he was obviously somebody that I praised a ton in 2022 and 2023. It's good to see him finally getting his due here in a different region, but still doing very well. Ale is the other player that I think definitely deserves a shout out here. The Nasus was very difficult to deal with. We've seen this before. We saw this in the previous series. When Nasus gets rolling, he's actually quite a difficult champion to end up shutting down and to end up beating in really any considerable way. And so, AL really taking advantage of that. Ale at times was zoning off 3 members of FPX basically on his own in some of these skirmishes. So He was awesome. Krako was great on the Lilia. Hope was very good. A couple of very good plays, even if he was the one that was going down a lot because of the lack of mobility. But overall, AL was awesome in game number 1. Definitely better and really dominating. And for FPX, not a great look, especially because the player that really got you all of your wins in the previous series was horrendous in this one. Kair is the easiest possible choice for dud of the game. Got completely outplayed both mid lane and, in the team fights, out of lane in the late game. It just was tremendously horrible for Kair, and it simply has to be better moving forward. He was so important towards their win over Thunder Talk that if you take him out of that series, as I said in round number 1, perhaps they don't even win it. So him taking himself out of this series by being so bad is consequentially not good for FPX. I think Milky Way was also very bad here on the brand, getting picked off early by the Lilia, and obviously giving that kill over to Shanks early on in the game was very not ideal, but it's not like he made any good plays after that. He was face-checking brushes basically the entirety of this game. Life was constantly getting caught out here on the Rakan. Again, a lot of the times he was dying for the sins of his own teammates, but at the end of the day, it's not like he was playing great before that. Dectum wasn't useful. ZDZ on the Aurora, people again are going to complain about this champion because of her pick potential. I agree, it's very strong, but people are learning to play around it, and her early game is so weak that it ends up creating this scenario where if she doesn't actually get go neutral into the late game, she can't actually do anything about the picks. She's able to set up a lot of these scenarios and not actually able to capitalize on any of them. And so, we're continuing to see kind of the downfalls of Aurora. Perhaps that gets better or worse as players get more comfortable with her and subsequently get more comfortable playing against her, but that only time will tell. At least for now, she feels relatively strong, but not broken strong. You can definitely still beat the champion. And FPX, unfortunately, didn't have much else going for them. Kair was awful, Milky Way was awful, and if that's going to be the case, this series is not going to be close. They need a bounce back here in game 2. Can AL take a dominating 2-0 series lead and really take full control of this, or is FPX going to tie up this series at 1 apiece and kind of take us to an even series state? Well, the winner of game number 2 was anyone's legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they have full control of everything going on in this round 2 series. Not only in terms of the scoreline of the series overall, obviously 2-0 is a great place to be. It means you only have to win 1 of the final 3 games. You've put FPX in a position where they have to win 3 in a row to even stand a chance at moving forward, but these games are not close. AL gave some hope to FPX in the mid game here, or I guess the late game, if you will, by just giving them free picks, by walking up and playing way over aggressive and not really taking them all that seriously. But even then, this gold lead never went below, I think 7 or 6K. It was never a close game. Basically from moment 1 when Ezreal picks up a triple kill, this game is over. There is nothing that you could possibly do. And speaking of Ezreal, Hope is going to get my player of the game here for game 2. When you're given that much gold in the early game, you better do something with it, and Hope, I thought, was pretty good this game. He didn't really make any major mistakes towards the back half, which is enough for me to say that the 2 major outplays that he had over the course of this game were consequential enough to get player of the game. I don't think he was perfect. I certainly don't think he was, breaking the game in any sort of way. These 5v5s weren't instantly won by the Ezreal damage, but the 2 major, skirmishes that he played over the course of this game were played so well by him that that's enough. That's certainly enough to get him on the board. Hope is an interesting player. I've never been ridiculously high on him, and in fact, I've probably been a bit of a hater of Hope over the course of his career, just because I think he's been on really good teams and not necessarily been driving any of them. I think he's kind of just been along for the ride on a lot of the teams he's been on, but he can get the job done if you need him to do that, and especially if he gets as much gold as he got in this game, it's going to be a lot easier. I think Ale is the other player that played really well in this one on the Kennen. ZDZ, to his credit, did some interesting things in the late game on the Aurora, as he should do with that champion, but Ale was awesome on Kennen. There's been a lot of discourse about this champion and whether or not he's even worth picking in Pro right now. Yes, he is very much worth picking in Pro. He's just not the auto-win button in team fights that he used to be. His numbers are relatively balanced, and so he just kind of does the Kennen thing. That's just kind of where he's at the current moment. Shanks was pretty solid on the Yone, got caught a couple more times than maybe I would have liked, but obliterated the matchup even when they lane swapped into the top lane, and then Kayle was pretty good as well. A couple of really good engages. It's really funny, the reason that AL's macro has been so good, I would say over the course of this split, is almost entirely due to him. His macro is just so insane. Obviously the shot calling, but I don't know if there's any player in the entire world who puts more of an emphasis on vision control than Kayle, and so it ends up in these situations where he's just able to get more information than other players are able to get. Sometimes it costs him, but for the most part, it makes this team more consistent. And that's a huge positive. Krako's really good on the Lilia. It's just generally a wipe for AL across the board. They're just kind of better in every role. That's not to say nobody on FPX played well. I want to give a shout out to both Dectum and to ZDZ, who I thought both had pretty good games. Dectum continues to really be the one that tries to stay consistent for this team, even when Milky Way and Care are having really awful performances like they are here. Dectum is still trying his absolute best to stay relevant in the bot lane, and he was relevant, very much so. On the Kai'Sa, he was doing a ton of damage. He was picking up a ton of kills in these skirmishes. If he had any sort of team around him, he likely makes this game a lot more interesting. He just didn't have any sort of team around him, and so there really wasn't a lot to do. Like I said, ZDZ was pretty solid here on the Aurora, a bit inactive, especially in the early game, but that's just kind of the champion. He was really good in the late game once that champion started to get online. Life was pretty solid, certainly not nearly as bad as he was in game number 1, but the middle of the map continues to be an absolute nightmare for FPX. This time it's Milky Way getting dud of the game, although I still think you could very reasonably give this to Care, both of whom were entirely irrelevant. Milky Way was much more of a negative than he has been really at any point over the course of this year, and quite frankly, he has been horrible in the playoffs, not only here in Summer so far, which he was against Thundertalk. He was the worst jungler in that series, but also last split in the spring when he was playing Ninjas in Pyjamas, where he got completely outplayed by Aki. Like, it's just not a good look for Milky Way, in my opinion. His style is getting pretty exposed. I think he's very one-dimensional, and unfortunately for a best-of-5, teams are kind of prepared to take on whatever dimension you are. It's not like a regular season matchup, so Milky Way really struggling, Care really struggling. If the middle of the map is as bad as it was in this game for the rest of the series, for next game in Game 3, it's over. It's going to be a sweep, and it's not going to be close. They need one of the two at the very least to step up and be positive, because Dectum and ZDZ in Life, they can't win the game on their own. And for AL, they want to get out of this with the sweep. I think they want to make this easy, and right now they look like by far the better team, and so I imagine they're going to have a lot of confidence going into Game 3, but are they going to be able to close it out in a clean sweep, or is FPX going to be able to keep it alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FunPlus Phoenix. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game, and they looked good here. I don't think this was a perfect game from them by any means. There still were a lot of good things coming out from AL, mostly from Shanks in the mid lane, who is playing significantly better than he did in the back half of the regular season, but FPX just had a bit more going for them as we went further and further along, most notably this bot lane, which has played pretty well over the course of this series. If you're talking about the reason that FPX is alive, it's Dectum and it is Life, and you got to be excited about that. I know you wanted to see some performances from Milky Way and Care. We talked about how if both of them were really bad in this series, that they probably had no chance, and that's kind of been the case up until this point, but if you're getting such a good performance out of the bot lane, that definitely accounts for something, and we're seeing the good parts of Dectum in Life right now. We're seeing what can happen if you give them the opportunity to play from an advantage. Dectum is a very easy choice for player of the game here on the Caitlyn. He was phenomenal. Milky Way finally said, okay, well, they're the lane that's winning, so let's go play towards that. Typically speaking, Dectum and Life are very bad in the 2v2. It's been their biggest problem over the course of this year. Now, that problem has gotten better in Summer. It's certainly a little bit less of a noticeable issue, but they've not really been all that great early on in games, and so give them something like Caitlyn and let Milky Way invest into them, all of a sudden, if you can get them a lead, which they were able to get, they can get to that later part of the game with an advantage, and they're already really good in that stage, and so that's really positive overall for FPX. It astounds me that it took them this long to find out that that strategy could really work for them, that something like Caitlyn could actually be really beneficial for their game as a whole, but here we are. FPX really leaning into that was a big positive. Milky Way spending a lot of time in the bot lane, essentially using the entire mid game to just follow him around and go wherever the Caitlyn is and fight wherever the Caitlyn is, because we can win fights when the Caitlyn's in it. Like, making the game that simple, turning off the brain and making it a little bit easier to execute, that is the way to go about this. The only issue that they ran into is that Shanks was actually still really good in this game, and I think in a different circumstance, perhaps Shanks could have carried. However, it just was a little bit too much. Dectum was doing way too much damage at the end of the game, and there really was no way to actually be able to answer it. You do have to give credit to the Braum as well. Life was great. It wasn't just the Caitlyn that ended up being very influential. It's not a one-man duo down in the bot lane. It was both of them, and I think that's the most encouraging sign. I think Milky Way not dying this game, that's all you can really ask him to do at the current moment. It's clear he doesn't have whatever instinct was allowing him to carry games early on in the split. It feels like AL just kind of has him figured out in terms of his early pathing. He's not really generating any sort of early leads, and the mid-game skirmishes are really not all that clean for him at all. However, if he is there to enable the rest of this team to be able to win games, that's a good role for him. ZDZ was good on the Cassante, certainly the better top laner, but that more has to do with Ale than it has to do with ZDZ. And then Care had his best game of the series, still definitely wasn't particularly good in this one, but was able to pick up some kills and wasn't a total liability in the mid lane. And so for FPX, you feel pretty good about this. Obviously, it's just one step into keeping this series alive, but it was a necessary step. And then for AL on the other side, Shanks was awesome. He did his absolute best to try to carry this game, but he just didn't have the firepower to be able to do so. Was getting out damaged by the Caitlyn in the mid and late game team fights, and at that point, there's really no way for them to be able to win. Krako was essentially invisible this entire game on the Nidalee, basically did not exist. Hope was basically invisible this entire game on the Jhin, lost lane early, as is, expected, into the Caitlyn, and then never really recovered. And then you had a couple of players just completely running it down. Ale and Kale were not very good in this one. Ale, very easy choice for dud of the game on the top side. Just got obliterated in the 1v1 in lane, and then was constantly out of position in the late game, was just walking up and dying, was getting killed in side lanes. He got solo killed by Care, for crying out loud. It's just not a good look for Ale. He has games like this every once in a while. You just kind of have to live with it. Kale was also not particularly good on the Alistair, but I think that had more to do with the game situation than it did individually him as a player. So for AL, how do I feel? Not particularly bad. I feel like I would feel worse if Shanks had a bad game and if everybody was just getting run over, but this was more of a it was kind of close until it wasn't anymore, and Dectum just had too much gold. I think in different circumstances, in different scenarios, they actually probably could have won this game, but it just wasn't meant to be, and they're only down one game now. If you go into game 4 and end it, people are going to look at game 3 as more of an outlier than they are the consistent reason, People aren't going to worry about AL in that way. But if FPX can come out and win game number 4, all of a sudden we're going into a Silver Scrapes game number 5, and both of these teams have completely switched in terms of momentum. AL has lost 2 games in a row, FPX has won 2 games in a row. So a very important game 4 that you do not want to drop if you are AL. Can they close it out here, or is FPX going to keep this series alive and force us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to round number 3. That means FunPlus Phoenix has officially been eliminated from the playoffs, as well as eliminated from the season finals, the qualifiers, the regional qualifiers for Worlds. Their year is done, and this was a pretty good run. I think all things considered, there was a lot of hype surrounding this team because the expectations were so low going into the year. Milky Way wasn't even the day 1 starter for this team in the jungle. He had to come in and replace Moyan, I think in week 2 of the spring split, somewhere around there. And they were kind of off to the races in spring, getting that top 4 seed, going into playoffs, not really being able to live up to it, losing their first series against NIP in the spring split, but bouncing back here in summer, looking like the team that they were in spring, showing that it wasn't just a fluke, that they were good, maybe not great, but certainly good, which is way better than the expectations that I and everyone else had for them going into the year. They were number 15 in my preseason power rankings, and so I certainly do think that they ended up overperforming that, but, unfortunately, this loss is attributable to a couple of members of the team. For AL, this is a team that I've really believed in, an org that I have constantly overjudged basically every single year. This is finally the year that they are living up to my high expectations of them, and they're really fun to watch. This is a very fun team, and we'll talk about them first. Player of the game is going to go to Kale in the support position here on the Renata. I thought he was the most important player here by a pretty considerable margin. Broadcast ended up giving it to Krako. Krako played an amazing game. I thought his pathing was excellent. His decision to really just focus on the bot lane was incredibly important for AL to just survive the matchup, to make sure that Caitlyn didn't get every bit of resource that they had in the bot lane, even if it didn't necessarily work. But KL was really the one that I think took over a lot of these late game team fights. The hostile takeovers were amazing. The handshakes were amazing. Just generally, the play from Kale was excellent throughout this entire game number 4. But player of the series, maybe a bit surprisingly for me, is going to go to Hope, the AD carry here for AL. I thought he was the most consistent member of the team throughout this series. I think if you want to give it to Shanks, he's obviously the more consistent answer. He's probably the more obvious answer here because of that game number 3. But I don't think Hope was bad in game 3. I think Shanks was just a little bit better. And I think Hope was better in games 2 and 4. And so I'm going to give it to Hope. If you want to give it to Shanks, I think it has to go to one of those two, but I thought Hope was excellent in this series. Really took his role as kind of the weak side AD carry seriously and was able to actually gain advantages that you weren't normally able to get from other players. And so Really happy for him. I'm not the biggest fan of him moving forward. I don't think he projects as like a top tier AD carry. I just don't know if he has the upside to be that, but even with Dectum and Life having a really good series on the other side here for FPX, Hope was the player that impressed me the most in terms of his individual mechanics. Of course, if you want to give it to Shanks for just brutalizing KR in the mid lane matchup, I think that that's entirely fair. I just wanted to see more from him in games 2 and 4. I think when you look at game 1, yeah, he deserved it. When you look at game 3, yeah, he deserved it for that. But, games 2 and 4, I think were just a little bit underwhelming in terms of the execution in the back half on the Yone, but that's just my personal opinion. Krako was great. Ole was really good outside of game number 3. AL just looked like a complete unit, and quite frankly, they were just better than FPX. This game was the closest of the entire series, back and forth for quite a bit, but even then, AL still very much had a lot of the game in their own hands, and they were able to make the plays that counted when it mattered the most, and that's what you want to see. And then for FPX on the other side, Care was awful in this series. I'm not going to try to mince words about it. He goes from being the hero, having a legacy series against Thundertalk, to being the villain for FPX. He's going to get done of the game here once again on the Aurora in game number 4. He was awful across really all 4 of these games. Game 3 was the only one where he even remotely did anything on the Corki, but games 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, and 4, all horrendously awful from him, and it's just kind of the duality of Care, being able to carry them across the finish line earlier on and then just not really being consistent enough to do much more. Unfortunately, this does kind of feel like who Care is individually as a player, the highs and the lows, and you're going to have to live with that if you have him on the team. But Dectum and Life were great this series, really nothing to complain about. Dectum, in particular, I thought played awesome across all 4 of these games. Game 1 was really the only one where it felt like he was even remotely outplayed. Milky Way was a bit of a problem. That's definitely a bit of a concern. I actually think that Kindred was okay this game, maybe a bit passive. I wanted to see him be a bit more aggressive, but I can't really complain too much about this game in comparison to some of the other ones. Game 2 in particular was awful from him, but he was looked upon as kind of the leader of this team, and he didn't quite come through in the clutch. ZDZ definitely could have been better here on the top side, but we really weren't expecting him to be better. He's not a player that had a ton of expectation coming in to the playoffs, and so for FPX, I think this is an okay result. Yes, you're not going to be making season finals, which is, of course, pretty unfortunate, but at the end of the day, I don't think anybody expected this team to be like a regional qualifier type of team. At least I didn't going into the year. The fact that they made back-to-back playoffs, won a playoff series, that in and of itself is already good progress for a very young team. And then for AL on the other side, big win. They still have hopes of getting themselves into the regional qualifiers, but it does not stop here. JDG has enough championship points in order to qualify if AL do not win their next series. Unfortunately for them, their next series is absolutely brutal. We're going to cover it in just a second, but at least for now, they put themselves in a position to potentially get there. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Playoffs round number 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen, the updated bracket. After round number 2, we can go over the previews for our round 3 matchups as we are here on the top side of the bracket. We have Ninjas in Pyjamas, of course, moving on to take on Weibo Gaming. This is a very intriguing matchup with all of the confidence and momentum that NIP has right now. Who's to say they can't win this? This is the best possible draw for them to get here in the top 6. There really aren't a lot of other teams at this point that I think they could have a realistic shot of beating, but Weibo Gaming is definitely one of them with how volatile they are. My only concern for this matchup is I do worry that Tarzan is just going to be a bit too consistent to be able to break through as consistently as NIP has. But if Xiaohu was playing bad, which I don't think is really all that out of the question, someone like Rookie could very much take advantage of that. Who knows? Zhuo's been having a great playoff run. Crisp has not exactly been the pinnacle of consistency over the course of this year. There is a real, idea here for NIP to be able to win this series. Weibo are definitely going to go in as slight favorites, but even then, honestly, NIP's in a great spot to be able to win this. I don't think they could have asked for a better matchup. If they're ever going to go on the miracle run, this is the way to do it. And then on the bottom side of the map, Top Esports is taking on Anyone's Legend after their win over FPX. I love AL, but there ain't no way that they're going to be favorites going into this series. Top Esports are gigantic favorites. Honestly, you could convince me they're favorites to win the entire summer split, and I would believe you. I truly think that that is possible for Top Esports. They are that good. They've been the best team in the LPL over the past few weeks. Really, their only stumbling block was coming out of the Esports World Cup, which they made a pretty deep run in. They came back and were a little shell-shocked, I think, coming back into regular league play. But ever since then, not only have they been undefeated in the last, couple months in terms of series, but in terms of games as well, they've just been unstoppable. I imagine this is where AL's run comes to an end, And that transitions nicely into the championship points kind of tracker that I have up on the screen here. Of course, you have to make top 6 in order to make the regional qualifiers. Well, I should say you should be number 3 through 6 to make regional qualifiers. Of course, the winner of the LPL summer split will get the number 1 seed, and whoever has the most championship points will skip the qualifier and immediately get the number 2 seed. But 3, 4, 5, and 6 will all play it out in a small little mini tournament in order to determine the final 2 seeds to go from the LPL. And up on the screen, you can see where some of these teams are standing at the current moment. Any teams, of course, with asterisks are still alive in the tournament, but JDG, it's out of their control. Right now, they are 20 points ahead of anyone's legend for that number 6 spot. But if AL wins, they will jump and usurp JD Gaming to take that number 6 spot. JDG is hoping for a top esports win. If AL win their series, they are into the regional qualifiers. FPX, of course, with their loss, is officially eliminated. All 5 of the upper teams are at the very least guaranteed to be in the regional qualifiers, regardless of what happens, because of the way that the championship points do end up breaking down. Weibo Gaming, even though they're tied with JDG, is qualified because even if they lose, they're guaranteed 60 points, and they will always have gotten more in summer than JD Gaming, which is the tiebreaker. So that's how the championship points break out. You know, I have a feeling JDG is just going to luck their way in. AL, unfortunately, might not have the firepower to get over top esports. If they were playing Weibo Gaming, they might even be favorites for a series like that, but, you know, their draw, unfortunately, is the way that it is. But let me know if you agree or disagree with my assessment down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions, LCS, LEC, and the LCK, as well as the NACL, Tier 2 over in North America. Playoffs are starting basically for everyone very shortly, and so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports right before Worlds, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.